Welcome to What is Truth, brought to you by the Southern New Mexico Church of God in Las Cruces, New Mexico. What is Truth is a weekly program which seeks to focus our attention on the truth of God's Word. Now, with this week's lesson, here's Pastor Meyer Stahl.
My guest today is Rolf Mitchel. He's a Holocaust escapee, and he has a story to tell about the history of World War II period. It's not taught in the schools today. It's great first-hand information. He's here to share it with us today. Welcome to the program, Rolf.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here.
Okay, before we get started, we're offering two free booklets. The first is, why do you observe Sunday? Why do you observe Sunday? That's the first booklet. Saturday is the Sabbath day, and the seventh day of the week, and we offer today, we offered before a $5,000 check to anyone who can bring their King James Bible over here to the studio and show us where Sunday, the first day of the week, is the Sabbath day. That's all you have to do to pick up your check for $10,000. Just bring your Bible in, your King James Version, show us where it says clearly that Sunday, or the first day of the week, is the Sabbath day. Now, the second booklet. Second booklet is God's Holy Days. Did you know that God has holy days that reveal His plan of salvation for all mankind? These two booklets are free. Just call the number that you see on the screen. We'll be happy to send them out to you for free. We have nothing to sell on this program. And you can have a DVD also for free. Now, Rolf, my friend, I have some questions for you today. The first question is, would you tell us something about your personal history, about your father, concerning the Iron Cross? Would you explain that to us today?
Well, my father served for the German military in the First World War. And I found on the internet something I did not know before because he never mentioned it, that in May of 1915, he had already earned the Iron Cross First Class. And a prerequisite to that award is that he must have earned the Iron Cross Second Class. The Iron Cross First Class is about equal to our Silver Star. And the Iron Cross First Class was presented to him by none other than the Emperor of Germany, the Kaiser.
Wow, that's tremendous information. Did your father do anything about the events in the early 1930s against Hitler?
Well, yes. Before Hitler came to power, he was working for the German Military High Command in an office that controlled the stationing of troops. When Hitler came to power, he was quite upset because he didn't believe in what Hitler was preaching. And I can recall very vividly, we lived in an official apartment right there where he was working, and one evening we were having dinner and somebody rang the doorbell. Father got up, he hated to be interrupted, and my mother and I stayed behind, and the voices kept getting longer and louder and more detailed. And finally, I heard my father yell something and slam the door. And neither my mother or I had the courage to ask him because when he came back, he was terribly red-faced. This was in 1935. About 8 o'clock that evening, my mother finally got up the courage to ask him what was that all about. And the first thing came out of his mouth was, "Those pigs." What pigs? Well, there were two men that were emissaries from Hermann Göring personally, with an offer that if I would return to active duty with the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, that I would be given the rank of colonel. I would have a responsible position in the Air Ministry, and the Führer himself, Adolf Hitler, would award me the Knight's Cross. And my father went on to say, first of all, I will not serve in the German military so long as Adolf Hitler is the leader of the country. And secondly, you can give this message to your Führer and tell him where he can put his Knight's Cross.
Wow. Well, so what happened to your father because of this?
Well, shortly thereafter, he was fired from his job, and we had to look for other quarters. And we moved into another district of Berlin. But he was so angry in what was happening and what he saw coming that he became personally involved in a plot to overthrow the Nazi regime. And late that year, in 1935, at 6 o'clock in the morning, we were still in bed, the doorbell rang. And there were 5 Gestapo agents at the door. Told us to get dressed, and they arrested my father and my mother. They figured I didn't know anything, so my mother said, go to your grandparents and let them know what happened to her parents. Well, both of them were taken down to Gestapo headquarters and grilled unmercifully. And of course, my mother had no idea what my father was doing. He never revealed to us what he was involved in. I didn't find that out until much later. So we had nothing that we could tell him. In the meantime, after the arrest, my grandfather put on his coat and went down to Gestapo headquarters in Moabit. And they wouldn't tell him a thing. He went home that evening, came back. Next morning, he went back again, nothing. On the third day, we were just finished with eating breakfast, and the doorbell rang at my grandparents' house, in the apartment. Grandfather opened the door, and here stood my mother, very haggard. She had been grilled for the entire 3 days and had absolutely nothing to tell them. So they finally realized she didn't know anything. So they turned her loose. Now, my mother, by profession, was a dentist. And she had a good practice. And later on, in 1936, they had the Olympic Games. And for some good reason, I think, the Nazis did not put my father on trial because they didn't want the publicity. After the Olympic Games were over, they put my father on trial at the People's Court. And it was just a matter-of-fact procedure. They convicted him of high treason and sentenced him to 20 years in prison. And he was assigned to be in the prison, they called it the Zuchthaus, in Brandenburg, which is about an hour's train ride from Berlin. And my mother was allowed to visit him once a month. Now, when all this took place, my grandfather, my mother's father, had 3 nieces, the daughters of his oldest sister, living here in the United States, 2 of them in St. Louis and 1 of them in Chicago, and he wrote them a very impassioned letter. You've got to get them out of here. And one of them responded with the necessary paperwork for me to emigrate to the United States, but nothing for my mother.
So you were the only survivor of your family.
Yes.
Is that right? And your father passed information on to the Allies.
Well, my father, while he was still working, knew what was coming because he was in the office that controlled the stationing of troops, so he knew the war plans, and he leaked a lot of that information out to the British and the French government.
Wow. Would you explain, my friend Rolf, would you explain Kristallnacht and where you were on Kristallnacht? Would you explain that?
Well, Kristallnacht is Crystal Night translated into English, was a very well planned and executed action that was done by the Nazi stormtroopers. And it was nationwide, so it was well coordinated. In the morning, still at dark then actually, they went to all the businesses and shops owned by Jews and smashed them. Broken window glass all over the sidewalks, all over the shops, and that's the reason they called it Kristallnacht. And in addition to that, besides vandalizing all those shops and businesses, they set every synagogue and temple, houses of worship, afire, and wouldn't let anybody in there to try to extinguish the fire. And I remember my mother and I were at home, and one of the elders of the congregation came over and said, "Rolf, the synagogue is on fire." I immediately put on my coat and followed him to the synagogue. We found a rabbi standing on the sidewalk outside, and we attempted to rescue the Torah from the ark in the synagogue, and the Nazi stormtroopers wouldn't let us in.
You were willing to go right into the fire, into a fiery building, to rescue those Torahs.
I thought it was my obligation to rescue the Torah.
Sure. Let me ask you this, Rolf. Was your mother affected by these events at this time?
Well, my mother, after my father's trial, my mother was ordered to perform forced labor at IG Farben Chemical Company. Now, IG Farben in Germany was just about the equivalent of the DuPont Chemical Company here in the United States.
Okay.
But she couldn't tell us what she was doing there. She was sworn to secrecy.
Right. And what age did she die?
She eventually passed away in January 1943 at age 42.
42. From the chemicals that she was working with at IG Farben, right?
Well, I didn't know that. At the time, I didn't realize that until much later.
When did you leave Berlin?
Well, the war began on the 1st of September 1939. I was finally called to the American consulate for my examination to get a visa for immigration to the United States. And passed that, received my visa in October of 1939, and was finally able to leave Germany in January of 1940.
Oh wow, that's some news. When we come back, I'd like to tell us about the letter that you sent to President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. We'll be back in just a moment. Please don't go away. We'll be right back. Rolf, I have a question before my first question. How did you find out what happened to your family? Would you tell us that?
I had finished my education and I was working, and one day I received a letter through the International Red Cross from my aunt, my mother's sister, in which she stated, "Your beloved mother died after long illness in January 1943. And of course, I understood what that meant. And your grandparents have been relocated eastward. And of course, I knew what that meant. That my mother had died from something, exposure to chemicals or whatever, and I didn't find out exactly what until many years later. And that my grandparents had been picked up and sent to one of the extermination camps. And I was so angry. Next day, I went over to the Army recruiting office, and I asked the recruiting sergeant I wanted to enlist. Well, at first he was really happy, and then he realized, wait a minute, you have an accent. Where are you from? And I said, well, originally from Germany. Are you a citizen yet? No. Well, we can't enlist you because technically you're an enemy alien. You're still a German national. And then he said, you had to register for the draft, did you not? Yes, I had to register for the draft because I was admitted for permanent residency. He said, well, why don't you volunteer for induction? Meaning that I would be inducted into the military service before my number came up. And I still remember saying, what's the difference? He said, well, your serial number will begin with a 3 instead of a 1. You know, big deal. Went over to the draft board to fill out all the paperwork. And when the draft board director looked at the thing and saw my place of birth, he says, wait a minute, I better warn you about this. You cannot be sent to Europe, because if you happen to be captured, the Germans can execute you on the spot because you're still a German national. I said, well, I don't want to go to the Pacific. I need to go to Europe. I have a job to do over there. And he's trying to humor me, and he says, well, there is a regulation in effect, and the only one that can give you a waiver from the regulation is the President of the United States. So I bought that at face value, went home and wrote a letter to President Franklin D. Roosevelt explaining the situation to him and asking for the exemption from the regulation, and sent it off. And so about 3 or 4 weeks later, I get a telephone call from the chairman of the draft board. He said, can you come down here? And I said, yeah, I'll be down there in the morning. I went over there, and as I entered the draft board offices, he came out of his office waving a piece of paper, and he says, who in the heck do you know? I have no idea. What are you talking about? And he says, this. I said, what is this? He says, it's an executive order from the President of the United States exempting you from the regulation. Well, I said, you were the one that told me to do that. And you believe that? I said, why shouldn't I? You're an honest man, aren't you? Well, do you still want to do this? I said, yeah, where do I sign? And I signed the request for be inducted into the military. And that was sometime in the latter part of 1943, probably November. I was finally called in December, sent out to Jefferson Barracks, Missouri, was the induction station there, was processed. Everything was done except the swearing-in ceremony. This was on the 27th of December, right between Christmas and New Year holiday. And they told me, well, go on, told all of us, go on back home, celebrate the New Year. On the 3rd of January, you're going to be coming back here and we'll finish it up. So they picked us up with the buses of 3rd of January, took us back out to Jefferson Barracks, swore us in, did a few more interviews, and they decided that my best place would be in the Army branch of armor. I was sent to Fort Knox, Kentucky for basic training and then advanced training. And when the training period ended, most of the people in my training company were sent to Fort Riley, Kansas, and ultimately to Fort Ord in California, and they wound up in the Pacific. And there were 8 of us that were left behind. And a few days after that, they took us over to Goodman Army Airfield, right there next to Fort Knox, took us to the East Coast, where we waited for a couple of hours, and they put us in the C-46 transport along with a bunch of others, and we wound up being flown to England. And I wound up being assigned to the 37th Tank Battalion of the 4th Armored Division, which was encamped in the vicinity of Portsmouth, England. And the reason for the location is because of our armor and our tanks. They had to be near a port so they can be loaded onto the LSTs.
Okay, would you explain, Rolf, about the bombing of IG Farben and what IG Farben had to do with the war effort? Would you explain that?
Well, what happened is I arrived in April in England and was assigned to the 4th Armored, as I mentioned. And about 4 days after I got there, I was on the way over to the mess tent, and I noticed a new notice on the bulletin board along the walkway. And it said, "Anyone familiar with Berlin, let it be known." So I went into the tent there where the first sergeant was, and I said, "Sarge, I'm familiar with Berlin." "Well, how long since you've been there?" "About 4 years." Yeah, he said, "I think that'll work." He said, "I think the flyboys want to talk to you." Well, the upshot was they took me to the 91st Bombardment Group of the 8th Air Force, and there were 5 of us in that briefing room. And there was a young lieutenant that put an aerial photograph on the wall, on the screen, and he says, "We've tried to bomb this target twice, and the reports we get back is we made a lot of kindling wood and toothpicks, but we never hit the target." And all 5 of us looked at that picture, we looked at each other, and we couldn't figure out, what the target was.
Go ahead, what was the target?
Well, I finally asked the lieutenant, and he said, "It's IG Farben." And I said, "What? The IG Farben at Erkner, which is a suburb of Berlin?" "Yes, why?" And I looked at that photograph, that aerial picture, and I said, "Where have you guys been bombing?" Now, there was a rapid rail station where the line ended right there, and he pointed to a spot to the right of that rail station. And I said, "That's not where the factory is." "Well, the picture shows it." I said, "Well, have you guys ever heard of camouflage?" He said, "Well, where is the factory then?" I said, "It's over on the other side of the railway station." "How do you know?" I said, "I've been out there hundreds of times. My mother was doing forced labor there, and I used to go out there when she came off of her shift and go back home with her on the rapid rail train, and so she had somebody to talk to on the way home."
Okay, what was IG Farben doing? Tell us that.
Well,
That's most
IG
important.
Farben was the major chemical company in Germany, and they were producing chemicals. What I didn't know until after the bombing raid. Well, let me go into the bombing raid, because I think that will explain it better, to do it in sequence.
Okay, go ahead.
So I pointed out where the factory was actually located. The group commander came in asked me the same questions, got the same answers, and he thought for a moment and he looked at me, he said, would you be willing to go on a bombing raid and fly in the Pathfinder airplane that leads the whole formation there and show us where that factory is so we can knock it out? And I was all of 19. I didn't know you can get hurt up there. So I said, sure, no problem.
1 minute.
So went back to my unit, and a few days later, I was told to pack a few things, and they carted me back to the 91st Bombardment Group.
Rolf, we only have just 1 minute. What happened to IG Farben? It was blown up. There wasn't what?
Well, I led the formation, and we bombed it, and the report that we got back afterwards, 2 days later, was not one brick left standing on top of the other.
You completed your mission.
It was totally destroyed.
Okay. Well, fine. Thank you, Rolf, for your information today. Again, we're giving these 2 free booklets out, God's Holy Days, and why do you observe Sunday? Just call us at the phone number on the screen. We'll send them to you free, no cost. And until next time, this is Meyer Stahl of the Southern New Mexico Church of God saying goodbye, my friends.
You have been listening to What is Truth with Pastor Meyer Stahl of the Southern New Mexico Church of God, located in Las Cruces, New Mexico. For copies of today's lesson or for more information, call area code 575-650-7359. That's 575-650-7359. Join us next week at this same time for another edition of What is Truth? Until next week, we wish you God's richest blessings.